So, good morning everyone. Thanks for coming along to the session. It's great to see a huge turnout. My name's Reto Meier. I'm a developer advocate on the Android team at Google. And I'm going to present to you today, hopefully, some pro tips on how to build expert apps for Android. Before I get started, we do have a couple of housekeeping notes. So we've got the real-time session feedback for those of you in the audience who want to give some feedback either during or preferably at the end of the session. Please don't take the advice of the previous session and give their bad advice to me. Maybe save it all up for the next session. For those of you who are at home watching via the YouTube stream, you can ask questions via the moderator link, which is up there, and hopefully we'll be able to get to some of those by the end of the session as well. So this is supposed to be an expert session, a 301, and it's a packed room. So I feel I need to ask, how many of you guys consider yourselves to be expert Android developers? Okay, that's a majority. Excellent. So those of you who didn't put up your hands, hopefully this will help get you there. For those of you who did, hopefully there's going to be some stuff here which you'll find interesting and new. I should warn you, there is a lot of code in this presentation. Don't feel like you need to scribble it all down now. The recorded video, the slides, and all the code snippets will all be available for your copying and pasting pleasure pretty quickly after I.O. So don't try and scribble it all down now. So as experts, think to yourselves, what do you think is the most common question that I get asked by other expert developers? I can tell you that more than any single technical question, the most common thing I get asked is, how do I get featured? Yeah? I'm sure plenty of you have asked me this yourselves. How do I get featured? How do I rank more highly? How do I show up in search results better? The answer is both pretty simple and quite complicated. I'm going to try and cover both of those things today. So let's start by putting this into a little bit of context. How many of you have apps in the Android market? Okay, keep your hands up. Now, if you don't want your app featured, you can put your hand down. Okay. What that represents is a graph which looks a little bit like this. Pretty much every app wants to be featured. I tried to make it to scale, but the half pixel didn't render. What's left is a group of people who don't know about featuring. Awesome. The tiny sliver is apps which are already featured. So let's have a closer look at that. That sliver represents about 30 apps at any given time. Now, if you do the maths, there's about 150, I think 200,000 apps now in the Android market. There's about 5,000 people in the keynote this morning, which means if the keynote represents the market, one person would have been featured. Now, even in this room, where you've got a much higher percentage of quality Android developers, say you're 10 times more likely to get featured, that still means that there's maybe 2, maybe 3 apps here which will be featured. So look around. If there's someone else who has a better app than you, you're already in trouble. So the simple answer is you need to build the best app in the room. The slightly more complicated answer as to how exactly you go about doing that is what I'm hopefully going to try and show you guys today. So I'm going to start off with some APIs you've probably already seen, we've already blogged about, but I'm going to hopefully show you new ways to use some of these existing APIs. I'm going to go through a couple of rookie mistakes, which I call them rookie mistakes, but I see expert developers do this day in, day out. So I'm going to put it out there for you guys so that you don't make the same mistakes. The bulk of the presentation, hopefully the last half hour if I run vaguely to schedule, is going to be pure pro tips, all code. So, how do you build the best app in the room? Well, in some ways it's actually really simple. You build an app that people want. Things like email, news, maps, these sorts of apps, people have been trying to get this information onto their phones since long before phones had internet connections. Where it gets a little bit more challenging is creating apps that people want, but they don't realize that they want. Good examples, Shazam, Google Goggles. How many of you guys have played Angry Birds? How many are playing Angry Birds right now? Yeah, that's all right. I'm not offended. So what do these apps have in common, right? They're apps which are a step ahead of the game. Whether it's using the microphone API to sample music, whether it's using the video APIs to be able to do image recognition, or if it's just simply using the touchscreen device with a high-res screen in a really great way to create an immersive gameplay experience. They're all at the cutting edge. Why do I bring this up? Well, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be using some of the more current APIs, some of the stuff which is only available in Gingerbread or in some cases Honeycomb. And the reason why I think you guys need to consider this is because you want to create that app which is better than everyone else's. It's not just about quality, it's also about innovation. And using these new APIs is a way that you can be the next Shazam, the next Google Goggles, or even the next Angry Birds by using these really advanced APIs and creating apps that aren't just things people use on their shiny new tablets, but they're reasons for people to go out and buy the tablets to begin with. And now that you all have tablets, you have no excuse for not developing using these new APIs. So it's not only that, it's not only the innovation, you also get to take advantage of the efficiency improvements on each of the platforms. So every user is using the most efficient app that they can. And it's also a matter of being able to create the best user experience. So everything is optimized for whatever device they're using. So let's look at how you actually go about doing this. It's actually not as difficult as you may think to create an application which works both on smartphones and on some of the new modern OS versions. This is an activity pattern I think of as a parallel activity pattern. And what you're actually looking at here is a simple pattern where you're creating essentially a shim class. And what we're doing, we start off by having a look at what is the version of the APKs we have. Do we have are we running on Honeycomb? Do we have the shiny new APIs? Or are we doing things on an earlier version? So all that happens with onCreate is that we're checking to see whether or not those APIs are available, and then starting a new activity, a different activity depending on which level of APIs are available. So here, what we call start activity, what this is essentially doing is meaning that this is just a shim activity. It has no UI. It doesn't do anything other than launch one set of parallel activity streams. Now, the good news is that you don't actually need to have a completely parallel set of code base. For the most part, your layouts are going to be consistent. If you're using the new fragments library, which is compatible all the way back to Android 1.6, then most of your UI is going to be encapsulated within those fragments, which means that your layouts, your fragments are all going to be consistent across those activity streams, particularly when you're interfacing using the resources hierarchy. So you've actually only got one set of fragments, say, which is just using a different layout to display the same information. Now, the advantage of this is that rather than having to have completely separate sets of activities, all you need to do is optimize the particular experience. And so for Honeycomb, as we learned, the action bar, for example, isn't available, isn't backwards compatible. So in a lot of cases, the difference between those two activities is simply going to be that on a Honeycomb device, you use the new action bar and the new animation framework. And on a pre-Honeycomb device, using the same fragments, but you're having to create your own activity bar implementation. So it's a way of being able to essentially optimize based on the level of APIs available. Now, that's one approach. The other thing you can do is just use good old interfaces. You're all experts, so you're all at Google I/O, so I'm going to assume I don't need to go into too much detail over what an interface is. But basically, it gives you the opportunity to create different implementations based on the hardware and software that you have available to you. So this piece of code shows exactly how to do this. So we're looking at three different things. So if you've got, what we're trying to do is find the orientation of the device. There's a few variations. The initial version, which was pre-Cupcake, had one implementation. So we're going to check to see if we are still running a pre-Cupcake device, which would be a pretty good effort at this point. We're also going to check to see whether or not we have a gyroscope, because we can use the gyro to smooth out some of those orientation changes. And then the bulk of the class is just going to go through here and instantiate a different implementation of that sensor listener. So all of the reflection, all of the does the gyroscope exist, all of that stuff can all be encapsulated way within those interface implementations. So that's one way, is using the new APIs, creating something incredibly innovative. The other thing you want to do is build apps which are really good. So a great way of doing that is by getting real user feedback. Now, my slides are already out of date. There's apparently over 300 Android devices available these days, and in well over probably 200 countries. So it's really something global. And the ability for you guys as developers to actually test for all of these devices in all of these countries is pretty much impossible. And the solution to that, so at Google, what we do is we have a system called dog fooding, where we get everyone within the company to use these new apps or new operating systems, and we can get a lot of feedback from them. Now, we have more than 20,000 employees, and they're spread all across the world, and they're all within the same corporate intranet, so it's really easy for us to get feedback. It's much more challenging for you guys, who probably have slightly smaller companies. So one thing that you can do to try and get that feedback is actually use analytics tracking, not just in your live version, but in your betas. So what we're doing in this particular piece of code is we're just going to track exceptions, right? So we're going to look to see every time an exception gets thrown, we're going to track that. So we can find out, is there clustering? Are we seeing a particular exception get thrown a lot in a particular country, in a particular language, on a particular device type, or just corresponding to a particular workflow? So it's all about bug tracking by getting as much information as possible. What's a little bit more interesting, I think, is actually doing A/B testing using the same technique. So we're going to start off just by generating a random number and splitting people into one of two groups, are they A or B group? And then within your onCreate method, we're going to set the content type differently. So it's either going to be an A or B group. Now, that layout can be completely different. It can be as complicated as having completely different button layouts, some in the action bar, some in the menu, some on screen, or it can be as simple as trying to figure out which shade of blue your users appreciate more. And because we're tracking each of those users based on the group they're in, we're able to see, how does this affect their engagement? Are they using your app more? Are they doing the things which you want them to do more? These are the sorts of things which make it much easier for you to understand how your app is working. It's optimizing your beta by getting real feedback as to how your app is being used, what the user engagement is, and lets you do that optimization. If you are going to do a widespread beta of that kind, a good approach is to use the Android market to do that. There's a lot of things you should take into account, particularly as soon as you're making it globally available, putting on the market. It's really important that you make sure that users understand that it is a beta. Now, whether that's by making a private beta with a login code or simply obscuring the name and making it unclear what the app is, it's important to set that expectation so that people know that they shouldn't be expecting a finished product. They should be expecting more frequent updates and slightly less polish as you bring your app to market. I've seen this being done very successfully by a number of apps which have launched recently, and it's helped them to create a better application based on what people have said rather than what they've thought. So, if we are going to do this, you introduce the idea of the first possible rookie mistake you can make, and that's not protecting your package name. Now, as soon as your APK leaves your dev box, the first thing you should probably want to do is put that in market, because the package name is unique, which means that if someone else gets your APK, they can upload it to market, and they own your package name. So now if you want to launch, you're going to have to change the package name, go through this whole hassle. I've seen this happen before by experts who should know better. At the same time, make sure that as soon as you've used your signing key to sign your APK, that you have backed it up, and then backed it up again in another country in a fireproof box. This is the only way you can update your app. If you lose the signing certificate, it doesn't matter who at Google you know, you bump into Andy Rubin on the street, he's not going to be able to update your app for you. So make sure that you keep that certificate secure. And another quick tip, when you create your market account, don't use your personal Gmail or the CEO's Gmail account or the intern who's doing it after lunch. That's the account you're going to need to log into to do updates, to do changes. You don't want to have to call someone at 3 a.m. in their holidays so that you can log into their personal Gmail account and change the release text. Next rookie mistake is going to be a little bit more technical. And that's assuming that the device is portrait. So you're all proud new tablet owners. So you'll learn firsthand that a lot of these tablet devices are designed to be used in landscape mode. Now what we've found is that a lot of games developers in particular have gone, well, my app, my game can only be played in landscape mode because I'm using the orientation sensors and that's how the layout is designed. And so they've done a bit of coding and they've gone, okay, so smartphone at landscape mode is at 90 degrees. So we're going to rotate all of our accelerometer orientation logic to take that 90-degree turn into account. Thing is, you put that on a tablet and it's at 0, 0, 0, because it's not just the branding which is orientated in landscape mode. It's also the orientation sensor. And so now, because you're making that assumption, you're going to get the orientation 90 degrees off, and your game is going to need to be controlled in portrait mode on a landscape device. It's actually really easy to get this right. You call get rotation on the display object. That's going to tell you to the nearest 90 degrees what the actual orientation is. And then you can simply remap the coordinate system on the sensor manager so that it's always zeroed out. So if you are locking the device to landscape for gameplay, something like that, assume it's at 0, check using the display get rotation, and then remap the coordinate systems accordingly. Another rookie mistake we see is people trying to detect and track a particular device instead of a particular installation. There's a lot of good reasons why you want to track a particular installation. You want to let people save settings on the server without having to create a login. That's all great. What you don't want to do is track a particular piece of hardware. Now, there's a few reasons why you shouldn't. The first reason is that it's actually quite difficult to do. You can call get device ID on the telephony manager, but if there is no telephony, it will return null. You can say, okay, well, if the telephony manager returns null, then maybe get the MAC address. If Bluetooth's turned off or Wi-Fi's turned off, that also might return null. And what's even worse is with both of these circumstances, if you wipe the device and give it to your friend or sell it on eBay, and someone else logs in, it's going to have the same device number. So now your settings are being applied to someone else's device. From a developer perspective, this is a really bad time, right? It has privacy implications as well as usability implications. You can use the Android ID field in secure settings. It doesn't work, at least not reliably, prior to Android 2.2. And even if it does, you're still asking the user for a particularly scary-looking permission. You know, this device needs access to your secure settings. And they're going to think, I've just downloaded Solitaire. Why on earth do they need access to my secure settings? The solution, again, is actually fairly straightforward. All you need to do is generate a unique identifier for the application. And so that's all that this code is doing. There's a lot on screen, but this is the only bit which is really important. We're going to create a new random, universally unique identifier, and then the rest of this code is simply saving it to a shared preference file. So from this moment onwards, this application is uniquely identifiable. So you can store settings, user preferences, all those sorts of things on the server. The last rookie mistake is a really easy one. It's a bit of a gimme. And if you've watched the previous session, you'll note that they gave about a half dozen shout-outs to the Android developer blog. We're not trying to keep secrets from you guys. We love doing Google I/O. We love doing all of these sessions. But day in, day out, each week when we're releasing new things or finding new opportunities to help you guys build better apps, this is where we're going to put the information. So if it's not already on your frequently read list, make sure that you check it out. That's where all the pro tips that I'm going to talk about today have either been or will shortly appear. So that's the simple stuff. I'm sure you'll be glad to know. The rest of this gets slightly more technical. So if you're not cool with lots of code on screen, now is probably a good time to maybe check your email, catch up on Twitter. It's okay, I won't be offended. You can sneak out the back. It's cool. So let's get on with it. So you're all experts. So I assume you already know the deadly sins, which I talked about last year. So you need to make your apps fast and efficient and intuitive. They need to be beautiful and generous, and you need to use widgets and all that good stuff. But I've got a few new attributes which I want to share with you today, which are hopefully going to help you transition from apps that people really like to apps that people love, that they rave about, that we want to use in sandbox presentations and have up on stage in keynotes. So I've got 4 attributes, and I'll introduce the first one now. Oh, wonderful. I should have pointed out earlier that I am doing something of an experiment today by running my presentation off a tablet. And this is what happens when the tablet reboots, when it tries to play video on HDMI, which has only happened once so far, not during the rehearsal. So I'm going to have to dance while I wait for this to reboot. It's a really nice video too. I think you really would have appreciated it. The big question is, do I try the video again after the device is loaded? Yeah? Give it another shot? All right, there's 4 of these videos, so we've got 4 additional chances after this for it all to go horribly wrong. A special shout out to the hundreds of thousands watching on the live stream. We'll go through all of these once again. Consider this revision if you didn't see them properly the first time. It's good because my session actually goes for about 50 minutes, so this extra time is really helping me. All right, let's try one more time for the first attribute. Yes. doesn't deserve a clap. That does. So, thank you. With that slight delay, and quite appropriately, I'd like to introduce the concept of freshness. So what is a fresh app? A fresh app is one which is always up to date. It's an app which you don't have to wait for things. You don't have to wait for the location to update. You don't have to wait for the data to be up to date. And in fact, in a perfect world, there is no such thing as an app being too fresh, right? Ideally, you're going to have an app which always knows exactly where you are, and it's going to have exactly the most current information for you to see at any given time. Now, unfortunately, as we're all aware, battery doesn't last forever. So a lot of the time, what you're going to have to do is find a compromise between apps being able to be as fresh as possible and have a battery life that lasts for longer than 2 hours. So what I wanted to introduce to you now is a couple of techniques for being able to have a fresher app in terms of location and data. So let's start with location. And one of the fancy new things which we introduced, I think it was in Honeycomb, it may have been Gingerbread, is the passive location provider. How many of you guys have heard of the passive location provider? Okay, decent few handful. For those of you who haven't, what this lets you do is listen for updates in location from other apps and to have them within your own app. So if Google Maps is running in the foreground, you're able to receive each of those location updates. Works exactly the same way as any other location provider, so GPS or Wi-Fi. Specify the minimum distance and minimum time that you're allowed. Specify that as the provider, and then request those location updates. Because you don't have control over what the underlying provider is, your app still requires the find location permission. And then when you do want to find out what the underlying provider was, you can simply call get provider on the location object that gets passed in to your location listener. Something which has actually been around for quite a lot longer but hasn't received a lot of use is this idea of being able to use intents to listen for location updates. So this is as an alternative to the location listener, is you can actually specify a pending intent, and that's what we can see here. And the most important part here is the action string which we're going to broadcast. So we construct this pending intent and then request those location updates. And instead of specifying a location listener, we're going to specify the pending intent, which is going to get broadcast. So now every time the provider which we've specified receives an update, is going to broadcast this intent. To listen for it works exactly as you'd expect. You register a new broadcast receiver. The implementation you can see there. The key part is that you're extracting the current location, which is bundled in with the extras of that broadcast intent. Now, where things get really interesting is if you use these in combination. So now what we can do is actually use intents to update your location even when your application isn't running. And how's that going to work? Well, we're broadcasting intents, which means you can register a manifest receiver, which is going to listen for those updates. So you'll note here that the action that we're listening for is the same action we specified when creating our pending intent for those location updates. And if we specify the location provider as a passive location provider, we've now got a circumstance where our app can sit in the background, not even running at all. And then when we've specified, hopefully, a pretty conservative min time and minimum distance for receiving those updates, our receiver is going to spin up and allow us to do something with that information. So all of a sudden, you're getting away from this situation where every time you get to a location, so you've just used maps or navigation to find your place, find your way to a venue, and then you have to wait 30 seconds while it gets the GPS sync and then downloads the nearby locations or the ability to check in. So by using this instead, it gives you that ability to have a much fresher location without having any additional battery cost, because you're relying on someone else's use of the GPS. Let's take that one step further. So what we're really trying to do here is find a way to get fresher results in that circumstance when you first start up your app. So even without using the passive provider or these location intents, there's a couple of techniques you can use. The first is simply to check what the last known location was. You'll note that I've passed in false here to get providers. And what this is saying is that I don't care whether the particular provider is active or not, just return all the providers. Because if someone's used navigation, gotten to their destination, and turned off GPS, that doesn't mean that that last location received on GPS isn't useful. So what we're going to do here is go through each of the location providers and find out how accurate was your last reading and when was it. If it was 10 seconds ago, accurate to within the nearest 10 meters, that's useful information. And that's probably a good enough value for you to start pulling down the current data without having to wait for your first GPS location update. Another tip, monitor the best provider available, even if it isn't currently active. Users can turn on or off GPS or Wi-Fi with a simple click of the button on the home screen. So it's important when you are using criteria to find the best possible provider that you check to see whether the better provider gets turned on. And then you can do that transition seamlessly without the user having to do anything. The other thing, so that pretty much covers location. So now we want to have a look at data. How do we get fresher data? Generally, when we're talking about data updates in Android, we're talking about things happening in the background. So how frequently do you wake up your app and have it pull down new data from the server? Well, generally, again, this is a compromise between how frequently you want to do it and how frequently you want the battery to run down. So what I'm suggesting here is that rather than doing that as a one-off, you actually make that variable based on a number of conditions. We can start off really simply. So if we're talking about recurring alarms, you actually have two options. It can be a wake-up alarm or a non-wake-up alarm. A wake alarm is going to spin up the device, even if it's in standby mode, just so that you can do what you need to do. So this is a great way of making sure your app is up to date, but it does have an impact on your battery life. A non-waking alarm is still going to get triggered, but it's not going to wake the device out of standby until it's out of standby itself. So if you say every 30 minutes and the user doesn't turn their phone on for an hour, that's when it'll get triggered straight away. So rather than trying to come up with a compromise between which of these two approaches to use, why not use both? Here we're going to specify a best case scenario where we're saying, ideally we want to update every 30 minutes, but if the device is on standby, they're not using it anyway, we can probably get away with updating only maybe twice a day. And then just set both of those alarms. I assume you're all using inexact repeating, but this is an instance where you can improve both the freshness by having those non-waking alarms happening more frequently and the battery life by pulling back on the wake alarms. Now that's a fairly straightforward approach. What you can do, which is a little bit more interesting, is actually vary those particular values, that best case and worst case scenario, based on the device state. Things like connectivity, whether the device is docked, whether it's charging or the battery's low, all of these things should have an impact on how frequently you want these alarms to go off. So let's have a look at each of them in sequence. So if we look at the connectivity, using the connectivity manager, we can check a couple of things. We can check to see whether we're connected to the internet at all. If we're not connected to the internet, you can probably disable all of your refreshing alarms, certainly the ones which are going to pull data from the cloud. If you don't have an internet connection, there's no point starting up the service, running the receivers. So just disable it completely until you get that connectivity back. We can also check to see what kind of connection we have. If we're connected via Wi-Fi, we can probably crank that number up. It's cheaper, it's faster to get those updates. Whereas if we're on 2G mobile, again, we probably want to scale it back. We're talking about battery. Let's have a look at the battery monitor. So the way the battery manager works is it'll actually transmit a sticky broadcast, which means that we can call register receiver, and even passing in a null receiver, as we've done here, we're still able to get the last battery status that was broadcast. Now, in this instance, all I'm checking to see is whether or not the battery is being charged or if it's full. If it's full, if it's currently being charged, then there is no battery implication from doing your updates more frequently. So in that case, you can probably make your worst case scenario, your waking alarm, be equal to your best case scenario. So you're going to wake the device every 30 minutes and get that update because you don't have to worry about running the battery down. Docking state works pretty much the same way. Here we're just checking to see whether the device is docked or undocked. You can also check to see whether it's in a car dock, a desk dock, if it's a digital or an analog dock. All of these things are going to potentially affect how frequently you do your updates. And exactly how it is going to affect it is going to be based entirely on your data. So if what your app is doing is checking road conditions, then if it's in a car dock, you probably want to do those updates pretty frequently. Whereas if it's in a desk dock, you may want to slow them right down. So again, it's a case of use the information in a way that makes sense with your data. And ultimately, that's what you want to do, is you want to take all of these things into account. We're on Wi-Fi, we're being charged, or in a desk dock, if what my app does is check sports scores, maybe during the game it makes sense to have that update every 2 minutes. The same app in a car dock on a 2G mobile network, which is actually decreasing in charge, you probably want to disable that or at least make it a lot less frequently. The thing about device state is that it's very dynamic. So I've listed these all together. They should obviously be separate intent filters, but effectively what we're saying is you can monitor to see, has the docking state changed? You can't monitor the battery level in real time, but you can check to see whether you're at a low battery state or whether the device has been connected or disconnected from power. So this is a really important way that you can modify how your app is behaving. And probably the most important is the connectivity change. So check, if we lose internet connection, then disable all of your recurring alarms and turn off a lot of your intent receivers. You can also use this to put things off. We have a 100 meg file we want to download. We don't want to do that over 2G or 3G, so we're going to set an alarm that says, when you have Wi-Fi connection, initiate that download. So I said something there that you could enable and disable your receivers. That's actually something you can do even for manifest receivers. So within code at runtime, you can actually use the package manager, find out what is the component name of your receiver class, and then we're just going to enable or disable it based on the conditions. So for that connectivity example, you're going to say, OK, when the connectivity changes, if we have no active network, then disable all of my state change receivers, because there's no point running up my app if there's nothing for it to do. So be a good system citizen and disable all of those things when they're not going to be useful. Most of these receivers, they're going to trigger services to actually do the work of pulling down the downloads. The key here is everything needs to be done asynchronously. I'm going to already assume that your services are asynchronous, that they're going to be short-lived, they're going to be well-behaved. One of the things I wanted to highlight is the ability to change the way that the onStart command return result works. So hopefully a lot of you already know you can either return start sticky, which is going to cause the system to keep restarting the service should it need to kill it in order to get some additional resources. And not sticky is going to say, well, if the system kills it to regain memory right now, let it stay dead. What the little piece of code underneath does is we're just going to have a look to say, well, when was the last time that it was successful? How many times have we tried to run up this service only for the system to kill it? And what that lets us do is make this variable. So we say, if it's been longer than what we consider to be an allowable period before since it last worked, force the system to make this sticky, and otherwise let it die. So it's a really easy way to make this dynamic rather than a one-off compromise. So that brings us to our next video. So please cross your fingers. So we're going to talk about how to make your app psychic. What's a psychic app? A psychic app knows things without you having to explicitly tell it. It's like a stage magician. It just seems to know things which you've probably told it at some point, but you didn't really realize that it would be usable in this circumstance. And it's the same thing with forgetting things. It never forgets anything. What does that mean in practice? Well, before I get into that, I want to point out that a psychic app has the potential of being a very creepy app. And it's very important if you're using this information to be very aware of how this impacts user privacy. You don't want them to go, how did you know that? You want them to be like, oh, great, that's excellent. I don't need to complete this again. So it's really important to make sure that users understand where the data is coming from and how it's getting used. So one of the ways you can do that is using the account manager. That already has the login names and email addresses that people have used to log into accounts on the phone. This is really useful information. You can actually go through and extract each of these account names. Now, to do that, you do need to have the get accounts permission. So the user will be asked, are you willing to let this app get permission to your account data? Now, this is a good example where you need to consider what the payoffs are. Is it going to make sense, or are they going to say, I don't understand why a wallpaper app needs to see my account permissions? Be conscious of that. Make sure that it makes sense in your instance. TweetDeck is a great example of an app which does this really, really well to suggest the usernames for each of the services which you can sign in, so Twitter, Foursquare, Facebook, etc., and TweetDeck itself. It suggests them all as auto-completions when you're putting in your data. Makes it easier, makes sense in that instance. We talked about never forgetting anything. So this is across the board. If you've got a native app which has an equivalent web app, make sure that those preferences are synced. They shouldn't have to put in the same data again. You already know who they are. They've given you that information once. It should be synced across those devices. If users aren't logged in, well, we already talked earlier in the day about how to create a universally unique identifier so you can track an installation anonymously. So you're still able to back up that information on your server. And then when the user does create a login, that shouldn't wipe their preferences. It should all sync together so that their phone-based preferences are now applied to their new web-based account. So what happens, though, if you'd like to back up this information, but you don't have a server to back it up with? Well, you can actually use one which we prepared earlier. So using the backup manager, you can back up shared preferences to our cloud-based backup server. So this is all entirely user opt-in. You'll note when you log into your device, it asks you, do you want to back up your information? If you say yes, it will remember which apps you've downloaded, and it will re-download them for you if you wipe your device. And in some cases, even if you get a new device, it will download those apps automatically, which is really handy. So using the Android backup service, you're able to persist additional information into the cloud as well, so that when they back up their apps, you're also backing up your application data alongside it. So if the device does get wiped, you're able to not only get your apps back, but the preferences for all of those apps as well. Really handy. Now, you might remember, so sorry, before I go on, I should say this is how it actually works. So for shared preferences in particular, we've made this as simple as possible. So you can see we're creating a backup agent helper, and within onCreate, which is this bit here, we're creating a new shared preferences backup helper. This is really straightforward. We're specifying the name of the shared preferences file, which we've defined up the top here. So that's just user preferences. And we're adding a helper for each of the keys you want to back up. So in this instance, you probably don't want to be persisting instance information like application state. You want to be persisting only user preferences. And so this is how you can define exactly which of those keys within the shared preference file you want to back up. To make that work, you need to add a new attribute to your application node, specifying your backup agent, and you need to also have a metadata tag which has your API key for the backup service. Right, so as I was saying earlier, you saw how we create this universally unique ID. Now, we actually did all of that by storing it as a shared preference. So what that means is that now you can use this in combination with a backup manager to persist that installation identifier if the user has opted in, so that if the device gets wiped, they get their preferences back and they get their universally unique identifier back. So any preferences that you have saved on your server side are going to be consistent on this new device or after it's been flashed. It's very easy for users to opt out or to clear their data, so there's limited privacy concerns. But again, you want to be aware of what you're storing on the server and how that's going to be identifiable to users. The last psychic tip is something which has existed since the very beginning, but a disappointingly large number of people haven't been taking advantage of, and that's intercepting links to content. So you've seen this before, Google Maps, YouTube, you follow a link, it asks you, do you want to view this in the native app or do you want to use the browser? You can do exactly the same thing, and it's as simple as adding this data node or data attribute within the intent filter node of the activity, which is able to handle that content. So here I'm specifying a particular website with a prefix to a path. Every time someone clicks on that link, it's going to ask if I would like to use my activity to view it. If you've built a native app and it's not the best way to view your content, then I've got some pretty serious questions about why you bothered to build a native app to begin with. Right? So make sure that it is the best way to view your content and then make it available to your users. Right, next video. I want to talk about making your apps adaptive. So what's an adaptive app? Well, it's one which doesn't stick out in ways that you don't want it to. Right? It should be invisible to the user. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have an app which stands out. It should. You should create something unique and interesting and innovative. But all of the things which you take for granted, text import, audio behavior, all of those sorts of things should just happen the way users expect them to happen. And that's what being adaptive is all about. So let's start off by looking at one of the most simple things, and that's text input. Make sure that the right keyboard comes up when the user is putting stuff into the edit text. So you've got a number of options. It can be plain text, it can be a number, it can be a phone number, it can be a date or time, and each of these are going to have different ideal ways of putting in data. The way you specify that is simply by setting the input type within each of your edit texts so that they show the right kind of input. So in this case, we're putting phone. That's going to show you the traditional phone dialer, because that's going to be the easiest way to input phone information. So this is all handled by the IME. You just need to tell it what kind of input you want. In the case of text input, you've actually got a number of options. You've got the option of URIs, email addresses, people's names. This is going to change not only what's available on the keyboard, but the kind of entry. For people's names, you want autocorrection only to come from the contact page, and you want to have each word capitalized. All of this stuff is going to be variable, and you're able to change that, again, by specifying exactly what kind of text input you want to use. So here we're specifying email and URI, and that's going to make at the bottom left of your keyboard, sometimes you see a little .com or a little @ symbol to make it more easy to type in a web address or an email address, and that is the attribute which is controlling that. When you are doing text input, you can actually add another level of flags, which are going to have a much greater level of customization. So you can control capitalization, autocorrection, and multi-line input. And in fact, in this example, that's exactly what we're doing. We're specifying that we want autocorrection turned on, capitalize the sentences, and we want to support multi-line input. And you know we've actually specified the maximum length of the string and the maximum number of lines as well. The other thing you can do with the keyboard is actually specify an action which should be initiated by the user when they're entering text. And so this is something you'll see in the bottom right of the keyboard. So if it's multi-line text, it's the enter key. Otherwise, it's going to be either the done or next. It's going to say done or next, depending on whether or not there's another field for the user to move on to next. I want you to think about specifying this explicitly. So if you've got something like a browser or an instant messaging client or a Twitter client, it will make more sense for that to say send. So the user doesn't have to close the keyboard and then initiate the action. You can do it all within the keyboard display. So this is how you do that. So you set the IME options rather than the input type, and you can see here we've specified the send action. And in this case, we've actually said, if we do have a hardware keyboard, something which has a solid enter key, I don't want that to represent send, because something like that, you probably want the user to explicitly hit the button rather than just pressing enter. But this is something that you can control, and you should control so that it makes sense given your context. If you are doing that sort of thing, obviously you need to then listen for those button clicks so that your app actually does something when the user presses the action. And that's what we're looking at here. We're simply going to create a new editor action listener, listen for a particular key press, and then do something accordingly. Straightforward. The next thing, so that's your keyboard. Your keyboard's pimped out. Your keyboard is doing everything it should do. The next thing I wanted to talk about is to have a look at how you can handle audio. So there's a number of different ways that audio is going to be impacted by your app. You're going to have volume control, you're going to have playback buttons on Bluetooth or wired keyboards, and you're going to have audio focus. So there's background apps, multiple media players can all be playing at once. How do you decide which is playing, which is listening to those playback buttons, and whose volume is getting controlled? Well, volume control is actually really simple. On Android, by default, the volume keys are going to control whatever media stream is playing. So if you've got a game or a media player and it's not playing audio, it's going to default back to the ringer. So in most cases, what you want to do is call this within your onCreate, and that's going to assure that every time you hit the media controls, I should say every time you hit the volume controls, it's going to adjust the stream, the music stream volume. Really easy way to produce something which is much more intuitive to users. Media buttons are a little bit more complicated. It's all intent-based, so you want to specify a manifest receiver that says, I'm interested in listening for media buttons. Create your broadcast receiver, and then simply listen, and that's the red highlighted text. We're looking at what button got pressed, so play, stop, pause, skip, etc. We mentioned that there are a number of devices which could potentially be listening for these media button clicks. So using this code, you're able to then say, OK, now is when I want to actually listen for those play button clicks or stop button clicks. Now, naively, you could put these in the on-resume or on-pause methods within your activities, but that's probably not what you want, because you still want to be listening to those media buttons even if your app is in the background. You only want to stop listening to them if another app is doing the playback. So the way to handle that is by listening for audio focus changes. So as soon as you want your app to be the main application playing back audio, you request the audio focus. You specify the stream which you're using to play back that audio. Music is going to be almost always what you're specifying. And here we're saying that we want to take control of the audio permanently. As an alternative, we can actually say that we only want to do it transiently. So we want to take control for a brief instance, play some music, and then return control back. So in that case, the listening app is going to want to continue to listen to the play, stop, pause buttons. When we finish playback, we abandon audio focus, which then tells the system that someone else is in charge of playing back audio. Flip side of that is the change listener. So this is how you listen to find out when another app has taken control. So if your app is playing back music, someone launches something else, they hit play, your app should stop playback and should stop listening for the media button controls because someone else is doing it now. The most basic case is audio focus loss, which is this one here. So this corresponds to the audio focus gain call when someone's requesting audio focus. There's two additional variations, and that's highlighted here. So you can then, the calling app can actually say, look, it's only going to be transient. I'm just going to play something back very briefly. I want you to continue to have focus after that. So in that instance, you probably want to hit pause. As an alternative, say, for example, if you are listening to an app which is giving you turn-by-turn navigation, saying, I want to turn left in 50 meters. You want to hear that, but you don't necessarily want to pause playback of music. You just want to lower the volume. And that's called ducking. So when an app requests audio focus, it can say it's transient and you can duck. So rather than pausing, just lower the volume. And that's what we're listening for here. Really simple tip for adaptive apps. Which is a really easy one, and surprisingly few people do it, is providing translations for your app title and descriptions in the Android market. This is a really simple one. Now you're probably thinking, it's okay, a lot of Android users, they're bilingual, they're quite happy to use my app. There's not that much text anyway, it's a game, it's fine. That's probably true, but when they're searching for your app in the Android market, it's a very good chance they're going to be using their native language. So rather than having to do your entire app, which you should still do, you can start by simply giving a really good, accurate translation for your title and description. Make it that much more discoverable for users who aren't native English speakers. All right, in the few minutes remaining, the last section, last video. It's about making your app smooth. So what do we mean by smooth? All right. So a smooth app is exactly that. Everything feels like it's running on rails. It's a lot of the stuff that Chet and Rahman were talking about in the previous session. It's about using animations. It's about making things fast, making things efficient. Everything, you should never have to pause for anything. And a key to that is really making everything asynchronous, really with no exceptions. Why is that? Well, if it's not interacting with the UI thread, it shouldn't be happening on the UI thread, or the main application thread as it's otherwise known. A 16 millisecond delay can cause a judder on a 60 frame per second animation. And that judder is going to make a user think that things aren't working the way that they should. So it's really important that you make your apps as efficient as possible and you put things in the background as much as you can. Now, as experts, I'm sure that a lot of these classes are already quite familiar to you guys. Hopefully, async task and intent services are mainstays of your arsenal. But I did want to point out a couple of relatively new classes, and that's the abstract loader class and the implementation of the cursor loader. So these are both part of Honeycomb. They're actually available like fragments as an external API, so you can use these to improve your app performance today. Now, the code looks a little bit scary. It's not actually as complicated as you might think. We're going to start off by getting an instance of the loader manager, and that's what's going to let us do the work. And then everything, all the magic happens here. So on create loader, now the cursor loader, which we're calling there the constructor with all those null strings, this is essentially where you're able to construct the cursor, which you want to load in a background thread. So the base URI there is the key. So that's the base URI to the content provider, which you want to extract content from. And then you can specify selection, projections, where clauses, all of those things, as you would if you were using a content resolver to extract a query in the traditional sense. Once the loading is finished, that cursor data is going to be populated and it's going to be passed back into your application. So all of that loading will be done in the background. You don't have to worry about what parts of the content resolution process happen on the foreground or the background thread. This does it all for you. Then you just get your cursor and apply it to your adapter or do whatever else you need to do with that data. So how do you know if you've done it right? Well, you start off by using strict mode. Hopefully, again, you've all used this, are familiar with it. Great way to be able to find out if anything like disk reads, writes, network action, any of that is happening on the foreground thread and fixing it. I do want to point out it's a development tool. You probably want to have it so that it only runs on the development version. It shouldn't make a difference, right? Because you fixed all of these things before you released. Just in case any have slipped through, do turn it off for the runtime version. You don't want the screen flashing or dialog boxes or verbose logging or any of that stuff on your release builds, so turn it off. So that's it. That's all of the extra attributes I wanted to go through today. Hopefully, I've given you enough information so that most of you guys in this piece of the pie can become this piece of the pie. And hopefully, you'll be able to come away with some ideas of how to make your device, how to make your applications fresh, psychic, adaptive, and smooth. Thank you very much. Now, I think we do have some time. I think we're heading into lunch, but we do have a few minutes left for questions. So if you do have any in the room, head up to the mic, and I've got a few on the moderator page as well. Lunch wins. All right. I'll read these out because I don't think we're going to get them on the screen. Do we have any tips for working with SQLite databases through Eclipse? At the minute, I rely on external tools to view data that is in the database on the phone. No tips. That is all you're going to have to do. Eclipse is a wonderful development tool. However, it is clunky. How many of you use Eclipse? Yeah, how many of you think it's clunky? Yeah, it is. So we're going to do a bunch of stuff. So there's some sessions tomorrow, or indeed later today, about the Android development tools. Should definitely check that out. There's some great information there for how to be able to use those tools more effectively. Yes?
About that cursor loader, if you use that to so do things asynchronously, but you actually need the cursor data to basically fill your activity, or you need to save away data into a database. You cannot really use that, right? You need to have it done immediately because the workflow of the app requires that you continue, right?
Right, exactly. So what you would do is you would have the cursor loader is going to get a new cursor, which you would then swap out for your adapter. So for most cases, what you have is a view, like a list view, which has an adapter backing it. And then you can call swap adapter, and it's just going to exchange the new cursor with the old one.
That's assuming you have an old one. So the first one needs to be done synchronously then.
Well, no, you still do it asynchronously, right? You just have your list view with nothing in it, and then wait until you have that data, and then start to populate it. Okay. Yeah.
So you mentioned the connectivity provider or connectivity messaging. Uh-huh. I was curious. We were using that, and it seems like you will go in and out of connectivity on a frequent basis. How expensive is that to wake up, let you know that you've entered connectivity, but it's not the right type, or things like that?
Sure, absolutely. So you want to keep it as lightweight as possible. So you want to have a receiver, possibly one which is happening in a separate process to the rest of your application, so that your whole app isn't necessarily getting spun up each time. And then you want that to be as lightweight as possible, of just checking to see exactly what the connectivity change is.
But that would be a separate process within the same APK?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
In your fresh discussion, there is a lot of things you can register for the event, such as low battery and the change and those things, right?
Uh-huh.
And then those things should have a dependency or priority or contradict each other, right? Sometimes. Is there any way you can define what those things need to be done by the receiver?
So I guess you can define that within your receiver to basically receive.
In that case, the receiver can have a code can be bigger and bigger. For example, they cannot just check low battery because they need to also check the connectivity sometimes, right?
Sure. So you can do that within your receiver. So within the receiver, you're just getting triggered by a change in connectivity.
So is there a good way that you can also define those dependency or priority when you register those things?
No.
No, it's not good?
No simple way.
It's not simple way, but you can, that will reduce those events basically, right?
Absolutely.
Otherwise, either have a lot of different events and then everything is up to the application. That may cause some problem, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. So you do need to be aware of the fact that if you've got 12 different receivers all listening for common things, it's going to have its own impact on battery life.
So if you can add some additional API for that, that could be good too.
Absolutely. I'll pass it on to the team. Yes.
You mentioned the passive location provider.
Mm-hmm.
How different is that from in the freshness sense of view from getting last known position? Like, I mean, you're going to get the same data, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it depends on how you want to use it. So the passive location provider is better if you plan on doing something with that data while you're in the background. So if all you're going to do is say, look, I don't want to do anything in the background, I just want to wait until the app starts and then get the last known location, you're better off just using that. Whereas if you're saying, well, I actually want to, say, every 15 minutes, every half hour, if the location has changed, I want to get that data, so as soon as the app starts, it has that current information. That has obviously a significant battery impact, but that would be the difference between the two.
Thanks.
No problem. I'll do a quick look on the moderator. You mentioned better not to lose your signing key, but how to update your app when your certificate expired. Pick a certificate with a very long expiry date. That's the reason why you can't sign your certificates with a debug key, because the expirations are too short. We will worry about how to transition them in 2050 when most of them should have expired. Please.
Hypothetically speaking, if we created an application and deployed it under our personal Gmail account, is there anything that we can do now to move that to another account?
No. It is a good question.
A new, fresh application?
Yeah, so the only thing you can do right now is unpublish the app, create a new one, and publish it. It would be nice if you could transition or indeed invite other people into a particular application. It's not something that's available now, but we're talking about, some of the guys who are doing improvements on Market are going to give a presentation. I don't think that's changed since the last time I heard, but they would be the right folks to ask. Do developers at Google use any hardware emulators to speed up development? If so, can you please recommend one? The soft emulator is slow. We use actual hardware where we have it, and we are trying to improve the emulator. So again, check out the talk on developer tools, and hopefully there'll be some news there. Yes?
Yeah, for various reasons, we're thinking of distributing our app on the SD card, and that'll be installed in the Android phones.
Uh-huh.
So is there, like, in Eclipse, ways to download that and how to do that mechanism?
I don't think I understand.
So we're thinking of physically, it's kind of a weird thing, but we're physically thinking of distributing the app on the SD card.
Okay.
And then, going to salespeople and then putting it in their phones and then running the app that way instead of downloading.
Yeah, no, there's nothing supported for that. So you could potentially install it from the SD card by navigating to it using a file manager on the device, but there's no simple way of doing that. Yes?
Hi, thank you. Does the location manager, when you register for location updates, does it hold a wake lock, or let's say you want to run continuous location tracking, and I know it's not a good thing, and we're not doing this for a consumer app, it's for a research app.
Uh-huh.
Do we have to have a long-lived service that holds a wake lock that will be alive the whole time that is listening for the location updates, or if we just register location updates, will that keep the service alive automatically? In practice, we've noticed that it seems like the service never dies, even if we don't hold a wake lock. But
yeah, it's hard to kill services, and because they by default will get restarted automatically for something like a location listener, it works. If it's music, then you'll hear a pause as the service gets killed and the system restarts it. So that's why you want to make that an ongoing activity. Generally, I think if you register a location listener using the intent mechanism, then that is sort of independent of any running application. So that receiver is always going to get triggered. Generally speaking, if you do want to have a service which continues to live, it's good form to set it as an ongoing service so that the users can see that in their.
What about the wake lock aspect of it? If you register with the intent mechanism, do you need to? Will that
Yeah, so you'll need to create. So the intent receiver will run for. I think it has a wake lock for within the on-receive action, which has to be completed within, I think, 10 seconds. So anything which is happening outside of that, you would need to have a wake lock for the service to continue.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Oh, and do you mind me asking, what are you using for the presentation? What app?
So the app for the presentation was something I hand created. So if including the video crashing, if you are interested, I will be looking to open source that at some point in the future.
I think that would be awesome. Thanks.
No worries.
Do you have any tips how to optimize compatibility on web views? Because some of the versions of the browser are broken on the JavaScript bridges and all this stuff.
Sure. Not my area, but check out the Chrome, the Chrome team's office hours. They are the browser experts, so it's not a Chrome browser, but they do know all about browser and those sorts of things, and some of the mobile guys will be able to give you some advice. Cool. All right. Thanks very much, everyone.